All right. Hope, I think we're live. We're good to go.
Awesome. Well, hello everyone and welcome. My name is Hope Lerdick and I'm an intern with Marble Springs State Historic Site. I'm so excited to be able to introduce Professor Nancy Laughlin Sofer as our speaker for our talk on women's work and domestic culture in colonial America. Um, Professor Nancy Loeffler-Sofen is a specialist in 18th century gender and family history, and she's going to go ahead and speak on that. So if you guys will welcome her and enjoy the lecture.
Thank you so much, Hope. I'm so happy to be here. And I'm going to be sharing my screen here to show you a PowerPoint presentation I have set up. The PowerPoint does automatically put some closed captioning at the bottom, so I hope that's not too much of a distraction and perhaps maybe a useful thing for you. So as Hope told you, I am a specialist in 18th century history. I mostly do European history, but because colonial North America and colonial Caribbean and places like that are, intricately connected to European history, it's not very difficult to kind of cross the pond and look at colonial America. I also, as you'll see in my slides, I also have a specialty in domestic culture and history through cookbooks. One of my most popular classes at the college is telling American social history through cookbooks. So some of that material will come up as well. So I like to point out that when you're talking about women's work, it really does mean that women work, that there's kind of an understanding in US culture and European as well that women didn't really work, that there's this sort of bizarre idea that like up until 1970s women in the US, women sort of like cooked and cleaned, but then suddenly declared, hey, we want jobs. But of course it's not like that. All women have always worked to some extent, and I think we need to just take a bigger view of what we mean by work, because it's pretty complicated. Now when we start looking at the households in early modern England, we will be looking at books in which or situations in which women who had servants to manage would step back and not do the tasks themselves. A unique feature of colonial spaces, such as colonial America, is that even women who could afford servants would often tend to do the work themselves. So colonial women work a lot, all day long. So one thing to think about, in the European model, in the Middle Ages, well into the 17th and the beginning of the 18th century, women's work would have been part of the economic work of the household. For many, many centuries, work done for the economy, work done to put food on the table, work done to elevate your family's situation. It was done in the home. And so peasants working the land, the women's work would be essential to running that farm. I've seen land contracts where it's very clear that the family is paying for the seed they're going to put in the ground through the work the woman does to spend the winter spinning wool into yarn, that yarn pays for the seed that they put in the ground, and then everybody plants and everybody harvests. So there's no separation between women's work and work in general. Production via craft guilds is the same way. The carpenter's wife would be managing the books, paying the workers, dealing with customers. She would be essential to the business getting done. And so it's only when you start getting into early industrialization that what we call work is removed from the home. And it's after that point that you start to see women's tasks associated specifically with the domestic sphere and the home and the children, and less directly connected to the work the family would have done for wages. The man will become the sole breadwinner in many places in the 18th to the 20th centuries. And in fact, that's going to be a point of contention. Manufacturing families will petition in England to stop industrialization because it's not fair for the woman to be made idle, the children to be left without work, and for the father to become the sole breadwinner. It just feels so unfair in that era. But of course, that is the way the economy moves forward. And so we adapt, we change, and family roles will be transformed by that process. But of course, that's going to take place a little bit later in the colonial era, which means that as European women start disassociating themselves with work for the market, colonial women will still be doing pretty much everything all day long. Now, this view from Europe is going to have an impact on how Europeans and people descended from European settlers view native women. So back in England, the only men who are hunting are elite men with leisure time on their hands. The only men who are fishing, if they're not fishing at, at the seaports for a commercial enterprise. Hunting and fishing are the work done by elite men in their leisure time. Agriculture in Europe is largely handled by men, and women are becoming more and more associated with work done just for the home. And so numerous European men, when they come to the Americas, they're astonished by the work being done by women, native women, because they're doing agriculture, they're helping to build homes, they're prepping and serving food, they're raising the kids, while the men are hunting and fishing, which of course to the native men is work, and to the European men looks like they're lazy. Like they will actually describe native families as, gosh, these men don't do anything all day and the women do everything. It's just, they can't make sense of what they're looking at. And I would say that this was equally true of southern nations like the Powhatan, the people the English encountered in Virginia, and the Narragansett, Iroquois, and Wampanoag that the English encountered in New England. The Wampanoag will be making a treaty with the Pilgrims at Plymouth, largely because there's local warfare in which the Wampanoag realize that if they ally with the English, they have a better chance of both surviving in the face of a much larger native rival. So they do teach the English how to hunt and farm and make use of local ingredients. Not quite the Thanksgiving story we like to tell, but there was an alliance there. And I think by an extension, European men did not understand how central women's voices were to the politics and religious lives of their community. And so they tended to simply ignore that contribution because they just didn't get it. Mataoaka, also known as Pocahontas, is later known as Rebecca Rolfe. She, of course, according to legend, saved the life of John Smith in Jamestown, which is probably not likely. And in the Q&A, if you want to hear more about that, I'm happy to elaborate. She does befriend the settlers, and she does bring them supplies. She does try to work as a diplomat between her people and the English, and she does have an affinity for the English. And it's not a surprise that later she does opt, although it's not clear how many choices she has, she does opt to marry an Englishman, and she converts to Christianity, and she goes to England and becomes the toast of the town before her untimely death. But even as she's growing up and she's serving all these different roles, the English are going to see her as just some kind of friendly child, and they will not understand that she's working for her father. She is a diplomat. Enslaved women, of course, were rarely afforded the niceties of the weaker sex. Even among indentured servants in the Americas, in colonial America, indentured servants who were white would have some pretty brutal lives. Remember that life in the colonies was harsh. At Jamestown alone in 1607, out of 500 original settlers, only 69 live. Life is hard for everybody. But indentured servants will eventually be categorized by gender, so that mostly white women who are indentured servants will be limited to domestic work by and large. And when enslaved people from Africa are brought over, there's no distinction between male and female labor. I'm making a generalization. There will be clear differences depending on where in the colony enslaved people end up. But for example, and status will change over time as well. So it depends on exactly when you're talking about and where you're talking about. The lives of enslaved women in colonial America will differ. But one of the things that I think often gets missed in discussions of colonial America, and especially with the work of enslaved people, is that we tend to think of these people as completely interchangeable, as if it's all unskilled. You just need bodies to put on the ground. And it turns out it's a lot more complicated than that. So for example, low country cooking, where rice is central, well, that was intentional. When the English are scooping up cheap tracts of swampland in South Carolina, they will know ahead of time that what they need to do is find people from a particular region in West Africa who already knew how to clear swamp and build rice paddies and grow and nurture and prepare rice. So the Carolinas turned into the rice belt because they picked particular communities for their sources of labor. And so they created that work and they created that world, they created that wealth. And it's one of the reasons why the Gullah Geechee of South Carolina still have such an immense feeling of community, because they tended to be able to preserve a kind of unity in a way that other enslaved people were not able to do. And so their work, it's hard labor, it's hard physical labor, but they shape the work of that country, that part of the country. So rice threshing, I have this this rice thresher, a wooden mortar and pestle. This is fabulous because if you look at the way that the rice is threshed, even some other elements of West African culture will come through in the process, where especially women threshing the rice together, they will pound the rice down and then click the pestle on the sides to get the rice kernels back in the middle of the thresher, and then they'll pound again. But they're doing this in sync with one another. So it creates this beautiful syncopated rhythm that's helping them stay in task with each other, and it's building music, and it's building a kind of pace for the day. In terms of running the colonial home, so this is stuff from my cookbook class. Most families, most women running a household in colonial America would have relied on a household manual, which, it's the basis for the modern cookbook, but it will include things on how to clean, home remedies, how to rid the house of bugs, and even things like how to negotiate a rental contract. Basically, this is your guide to adulting in the 17th century. Everything you need to know about being an adult is in this book. There were subsets called dietaries, which are about nutrition. They're not about losing weight. They're about making sure you have enough to eat and you're getting the right nutrition. And something called secret books, which were very popular. These were think about Keeping Up with the Kardashians. These are books about what's really like in the palace of Princess Charlotte. So household manuals based on the lives of the rich and famous. I don't know how useful that would be for the average colonial woman, but some secret books did make their way to the Americas and they were embraced by many people because it would have included special recipes. Like if you wanted to borrow someone's cookbook to make a special meal, it would be so cool to make a noble styled meal. My students are often thrilled, if not disgusted, by some of the recipes in these household books, because you can tell by looking at them. And you know, there's a sense that we're returning to some of this in modern sustainable farming movements, that no part of the animal should be wasted. So the recipes will be for everything: brains, tongue, ears, feet, like everything you think of now. Many of our students and maybe many of us are still accustomed to thinking about meat as something that you get, you know, you can get the perfect steak and nothing else. You can get chicken breast and nothing else, which means that there are vast piles somewhere of chicken byproducts and parts that don't get used up. So the colonial woman, the colonial chef would have had to figure out how to make the best use of every possible part so as not to waste anything. And that's an essential part of running the household. You have to figure out what to do with everything at your disposal because nobody could afford to waste anything. And it's all done by hand. Some of the recipes in the 17th and early 18th century cookbooks I've seen, they say allow, 3 to 4 hours just for the cooking. Well, if you're going to roast a turkey, it's all well and good to have 4 hours to do that. But that doesn't even include, of course, killing the turkey, plucking the turkey, butchering the turkey. So all of that, it can take so many hours of every day. And you don't see that a lot. There will be many generations. You can even just grab a cookbook from any era of American history and see how long the average recipe takes. And that alone will tell you a lot about what's expected in the middle of a person's day. In World War II era cookbooks, a lot of the recipes are like, okay, well, you're Rosie the Riveter. We know you got other things going on. Here's how to get food on the table in 20 minutes. Well, in the 1950s, when the men come home and you want to make everybody feel loved and nurtured, well, here's how to take 5 hours to make a meal that will please everybody. So in colonial cookbooks, very clear, you need to set aside hours just because that's how long it takes to get everything done. And so if you have servants to get all that done, all the better. If you're by yourself, maybe with the assistance of some small children, you're going to have to account for all of that labor. You get up first thing in the morning, ready to start the day. And I'm sorry, this recipe here is a little pixelated in my picture here, but there is a need for adaptation. So not surprisingly, there are not going to be very many English recipes that call for pumpkin, or even what we call corn, maize. Anything that's a Native American product is not going to appear in an English cookbook. And even the English cookbook, of course, will have a recipe for how to make artificial venison. Because as I said, hunting is a gentleman's pastime. If you're hunting for venison and you're in somebody else's forest, you go to jail for poaching. So how do you pretend that you're eating the rich foods of the elite? Well, you take some beef and you make it taste like venison because you're never going to really get any venison. Whereas this is kind of funny in America, right? Because you can get deer all over the place. So there would be no need for an artificial venison dish. You get the real thing. And the home remedies. Home remedies have been part of what we might consider cookbooks or household manuals going back to the Middle Ages. And they change all the time. So this as well, some of the other things I've been showing you from Eliza Smith's Complete Housewife, that's the particular household manual I've been using. Eliza Smith's Complete Housewife from 1732. And this is her excellent medicine for shortness of breath. It involves honey and nutmeg and a couple and gingers. It doesn't sound too bad actually, and maybe it might clear up some congestion. That same cookbook, however, includes a recipe for how to cure the plague or any pestilential disease. And it calls for an ingredient called mithridate, which is kind of a mythical ingredient. And it actually has 65 ingredients in just the mithridate. And most of them are hard to find, or I don't know, maybe even made up. You'll see home remedies like this well into the 19th century. One of my favorite recipes of all comes from an 1879 Virginia housewife cookbook called the recipes for something called a chill pill. And it literally calls for strychnine and arsenic. Those are key ingredients. So home remedies, kind of sketchy. This is, of course, a revolutionary document. I include it because I think even though it's written in 1796, it will reflect things about lives for colonial women. So we can look at the books written in England that are being used by colonial women, but it's very different to see what happens when Amelia Simmons, an American orphan, writes American Cookery in 1796. And she makes some things very clear. We are self-sufficient. We, the new United States of America, we are self-sufficient. And so let me tell you, unlike some of these cookbooks you've seen from England that tell you what to tell your servants to do, we're all doing it for ourselves because that's how we've been rolling all this time. She says, some of you might not be as experienced. Maybe you don't have somebody to train you. So her recipes are going to tell you, okay, if you have an older piece of beef or a bigger one, it's going to take this much time. This is how you check for doneness. This is when you take it off the fire. Earlier recipes don't include instructions. They just assume somebody's showing you how to do it. The mistress is training the servant. The chef is training the apprentice. Well, no, in America, we do things for ourselves. And so she creates this cookbook. And she also includes all of these Native American ingredients. The pumpkin becomes a symbol of our independence. Turkey, corn, and she's got election day cake. She has a cake called Election Day cake. Like everything is a celebration of how unique America is. And they're really, really fun if you ever get a chance to look at this cookbook. There's a textbook I use in my class called United Tastes of America. And these are a couple of pages from that book. And this is simply to demonstrate. So it's hard to see probably on your screens, but Amelia Simmons' recipe for a bread pudding is copied word for word in this this manuscript cookbook. One of the things that women in America often did was, the printed word is sometimes hard to come by, and even a pretty cheap book is expensive and out of reach. So what might happen is that the pastor's wife might buy a copy, or someone in the neighborhood would buy a copy and would pass it around town. So you would find these handwritten collections of recipes based on whatever book the neighborhood owned, and you would get your turn with it, and you would make notes about the recipes you want to keep. We still see this in a lot of cookbooks, right? Some cookbooks even had blank pages for notes and reminders. So that's a fun part of cookbooks, is seeing the imprint left on them by the people who shared them. Now, the kitchen itself is really very interesting. So there's usually only one work surface. Your average kitchen would be, and especially in a modest home, your average kitchen would have basically one table with maybe a bench to sit on, but probably not a chair. Maybe a low chair by the fireplace. There's an open fire. You're cooking in an open fire. It's not until the 19th century that you see, early 19th century, you might see some well-off homes having a kind of oven, kind of wood stove. But the open fire was what most people had to work with throughout the 17th and 18th centuries. You cook by hanging pots on a hook over the fire or by putting a Dutch oven right in the embers. And that can be a tricky way of cooking. I'll get back to that in a minute. But I want to talk about these dishes. The dishes are hung from hooks or stored upside down. A lot of times when you go into a living history museum or, a historic home, the dishes are displayed the way we would do them today, with the cups all facing upward. But of course, in the colonial kitchen, you don't turn that cup upside down and keep it like that. Next time you reach for it to make yourself a cup of tea, it's probably going to be full of mouse droppings, and that's disgusting. So you're going to keep them stored upside down to keep them clean until you need them. Because washing is a huge deal. Washing is just so much work. It might take you hours to prepare to cook and then hours to cook. Well, and then you got to fill 2 kettles with water, one of them to heat up over the fire so that you can wash all your dishes and then rinse them in the clean rinse water and then dry them off and put them all away again. If you don't have a source of water right outside your door, haven't dug a well yet, have to walk to the stream, you'll have a barrel in the kitchen where somebody, possibly even you yourself, has carried buckets to fill it up on a regular basis. So having water nearby is a very big deal. These kitchens are often smoky and small. Your only ventilation might be from a window that's left open, maybe a door open if it's not too cold. So you might have a room that's mostly cold, but you're right up against the fire. And you're cooking on the floor. There's so much bending down. You have to bend down all the time to get stuff off the hook or to get stuff closer to the embers. You can see in this picture from the Giddings house in New Hampshire, this Dutch oven is right near the embers. At Fort Loudon, during one of their living history days, I was talking to a woman who was baking a pie right in that Dutch oven. And she was lamenting the fact that she had gotten caught up in some other task while the pie was baking, and she forgot to turn it quickly enough. So one side of her pie was very dark brown and one side of her pie was kind of pale. You have to turn the oven every so often. So you have to be on top of this stuff all the time in order to make the dishes work. All right, I'm trying to keep a good eye on the time here. There's a video series I like to watch on YouTube called the Townsend videos. And Mr. Townsend does 17th and 18th century cooking. Like it's a series hosted by a man, but he's recreating the kind of work that you'd have to do to run a colonial kitchen. But of course, he admits right in his own videos that when he created his video kitchen to make his videos, he created a work surface where he builds a fire basically at table level, and then that way he can make his videos without having to crawl on the floor or get a little low chair. It's just so hard to do that. If you did have a kind of oven, and Fort Loudon does have one like this, it's a deep kind of beehive cave where you would run your fire for hours and hours, and only then would you push the embers to the side, and then whatever you wanted to bake, you put right in the middle of that, and then you close it up. But of course, the heat escapes every time you open it up, and you can't restart the fire. And you have to have a very good sense of whether it's a hot fire or a slow fire. So a quick fire or a slow fire, to keep track of all of that stuff. Consumer culture, you know, even in very early colonial America, you're going to have people who have lots of stuff, stuff from the home country, stuff from exotic lands, even flatware. Early elite families would have flatware. And I have an image here of some very early colonial utensils, a very long fork, a long kind of butter knife, and a huge spoon. If you were very lucky, you had one set of these utensils for every member of your family. Some families had to share, and some families might have a fork and knife for mom and dad, and all the kids get a big spoon. And maybe sometimes they don't even use dishes for the kids. They just kind of surround a pot and eat out of it at the same time. It's really after the revolution that you see a lot more consumer culture spreading a lot more quickly. Things that would have happened in England or France in the 17th, early 18th century are not really accessible to the people of colonial America until after the revolution, until the economy starts really thriving. And then you start seeing some really fancy stuff, like people, having special chairs for the dining room versus the desk you're writing at. Special chairs for lounging by the fire. Like you have chairs for different uses now. That's fabulous. With eating utensils in particular, during the colonial era, a lot of wealthy families would have been using pewter, which some have linked to lead poisoning. There's additional work in that there's more to clean, whereas more modest people would have had still wooden dishes and wooden spoons and that sort of thing. So it's not as clean, not as fine if you have a modest set of dishes, but that's also easier to take care of. I'm going to I still have plenty of time, I think. I'm going to talk a little bit now about some different parts of of colonial America. So naturally, what you see is there's a great deal of difference between the northern colonies and the southern colonies. And part of that is because of the purpose for why people came over, what they found when they got here, and kind of how relations with the natives, what's life like when they get here. So a couple of things I've already alluded to. In Jamestown, you're going to have in 1607 this very stark, deadly place to live. Out of 500 settlers, only 69 survived the first year. And they're going to rely on the relationship with the Powhatan, with Pocahontas as their diplomat. But after her father dies and John Smith returns to England, relationship will sour and warfare will break out between the English settlers and the Powhatan. And so that's going to make life very different there. My next slide is more about Jamestown. Up in New England, you had, of course, a very different kind of settlement. Up in New England, it's much later, it's 1620, when the Pilgrims come over to Plymouth, and they will encounter the Wampanoag, and they will create an alliance with the Wampanoag that allows the English people in New England to settle down. But the Puritans will come to New England for the purposes of creating a religious community where they could kind of control control their own religious lives. So there is a kind of religious freedom that they are coming to look for. But they're also trying to sort of get away from corrupting influences. So that's not just, freedom of religion, it's freedom from all kinds of other things. They don't want messing with their lives. And they create this very carefully controlled lifestyle, where even though non-Puritans are added to the settlers over time in Massachusetts Bay Colony, they will still kind of the Puritans will still kind of stay in charge. The differences here are that Puritans tended to come over as families. So you'd have whole families come over. And the women would often be literate because being able to read scripture and have Bible study was central to that religious life. So their purpose in coming here was to treasure this religious life. And that required literate women and entire families to come over at a time. And that's going to have an impact on the kind of settlement you have. Now, Rhode Island is founded in part because Roger Williams, though he is a Puritan, he has a different interpretation of how Puritanism should be lived out. He wanted to see a lot more freedom to worship in different ways. And he was also troubled by the way in which many of the English dealt with the Wampanoag Indians. So he, after either quitting or being exiled from Massachusetts Bay Colony, Roger Williams will go on to Rhode Island, and he will deal with the Narragansett respectfully, and he will purchase land from them, and he will even learn the Narragansett language, in part so he can have these negotiations. So the slide I have up in front of you now is Smith Plantation. It's in Rhode Island. And it is on this land that's purchased by Roger Williams from the Narragansett. And eventually it's going to be purchased by Richard Smith, a friend of Williams from Gloucestershire, England. And he's going to build a trade post and a tavern. And he's going to have a plantation. Now, the Rhode Island plantation, the New England plantation, is less like the farming, the agricultural plantation you have in the South. It's more going to be about livestock. So livestock, trade posts, it's going to be a commercial enterprise, not a farming one necessarily. And here we run into a pattern we will see typically throughout most of the histories of colonial America, most of the histories of this era. We have volumes and volumes of information about the men in this story. But of course, it wouldn't have worked at all without the women. So there are a couple of different women that made Smith Plantation in Rhode Island a success. So Richard Smith's wife, Joan, while Richard will be traveling quite a bit on business enterprises, Joan Smith is actually going to run the inn and oversee the farm. So she's doing the work of the head of household when he's away, which is pretty frequently. She's also credited with having brought a particular kind of cheese to Rhode Island. There's something called Cheshire cheese. She brought with her the recipe from England, and she started using local dairy on her farm to recreate this Cheshire cheese, and it started to be known as Rhode Island cheese. These kinds of enterprises are not uncommon. A lot of New England colonial women would have had side projects that were completely on their own, and the rest of their time they would be running the household for the whole family, including servants and employees and visitors. So she gradually made a name for herself as the creator and supplier of Rhode Island cheese. Her daughter-in-law, Esther, was remembered as a generous hostess and caregiver. She ran the tavern as well, and she ran the trade outpost, and she ran the dining room and inn. So she took over operation of the tavern and inn after her mother-in-law passed away. And Joan's daughter, Abigail Newton Updike, would be noted as a healer, skilled in home remedies, so skilled with her herbal remedies that she would be called on to tend to families around the whole neighborhood. Jamestown, as I said, was a pretty deadly place to settle. So in 1607, you have only 69 people survive. The second supply, that's a very gentle way of saying, now that almost everybody's dead, we're going to send a whole other ship full of people. In 1608, a whole other ship full of people will come, and there will be only 2 women on board that ship. And we know not very much about their lives. But about 10 years later, England is going to realize that the colony in Jamestown is not going to survive for very long in this way. So while you had entire families going to New England, to Puritan New England, entire families, in Jamestown, because the whole purpose of that colony in the beginning was to make one's fortune, what you have are a lot of men coming over without their families, without a bride, without many plans. And sadly, what happens when Jamestown turns out to be this kind of deadly swamp, it's being settled by men with no farming experience. Many of whom have no expertise in how to build at all. And that's why they rely on the Powhatan so much. And so in 1619, when a ship full of brides show up, women recruited from all over British territories, England itself and other British places, they will gather up as many women without other options as they can and send them to Jamestown and then marry them off. And they would set about helping the men to build Virginia. And so they're going to handle just about everything. In fact, the caption on the image in this slide is 2 women carrying a vat in between them. The caption, which didn't appear on my slide for some reason, they're women who go through town to pick up waste to dump. So human waste and animal waste. So they're basically cleaning the streets and making it sanitary. So the women, the arrival of all those brides helps make families and homes and farms. Rolfe, the man who married Pocahontas, he's going to be the one who really introduces large-scale tobacco farming, which is going to make Virginia start to pay off for the English colonists. And women will be having to run those farms and their homes and make life possible while the cash crop is being raised. They were believed to have brought stability, but I think they also brought just plain old survival. And the thing is that English law was pretty strict about the place of women. And Englishmen in New England and Virginia alike may very well have wanted to replicate a very clear hierarchy with the man's the head of the household and the woman is submissive and yielding and obedient. But the harsh realities of life in America during the colonial era meant that a lot of these women had to do a lot more work. They had to take charge a lot more clearly. They had to stand up for themselves a lot more. And their strength made the land possible, but it required them gaining a little bit more independence. On larger estates in Virginia, as it's growing and expanding, women, elite white women especially, will be able to take responsibility for the household that will include children, extended kin, servants, and enslaved people. And since they had to be in charge of all of those people, even when their husbands were gone, that meant that they needed to be not the submissive wives their husbands might have liked. They needed to be in charge. And so we see a lot of that in the heritage of the strong women. There's some in between New England and Virginia. There's a whole scope of difference, of course. You're going to have lands that were originally settled by the Dutch, by Germans, but you're going to see a lot more difference in what women expect and what women are expected to do in cultures that had been originally Dutch or German, and that are now sort of being taken over by English law, but that goes against the grain there. But one of the things you will find definitely in New England and Virginia and Appalachia, a lot of women running taverns, a lot of women running inns, a lot of women caretakers. Because even if work for the economy was slowly being pulled away from the home and put in manufacturing and put in shops that are not part of the household. When women do take over businesses or enterprise, not surprisingly, they're often connected to the domestic sphere, so that you have women who are caring for guests in an inn the same as they would have cared for the members of their own household. So it's an extension of the women they're doing in the domestic sphere that's becoming public. It's the public version of what they do for home. Now, the couple of people I want to mention from Appalachia, I will say right here and now, I am dead certain that the regulars at Marble Springs State Historical Site know more about Nancy Ward and Sarah Hawkins Sevier and Catherine Bonnie Kate Cheryl Sevier than I ever will. But I want to talk about them because I think it's interesting that to see the ways in which the frontier at and after the Revolutionary War, the colonial, what had been the colonial frontier, what is the US frontier, it replicates a lot of the patterns I already told you about for New England and Virginia. So Appalachia is considered backcountry until the middle to the late 18th century, with settlement occurring just after the American Revolution, which means that the women's lives here were often as severe as the lives of women in Plymouth and Jamestown a century earlier. So we are replicating a lot of these same conditions. We're seeing the same negotiations dealing with both outright conflict and occasional negotiation between Native American peoples and people descended from English and other European settlers. So Nanyehi, or also known as Nancy Ward, beloved woman of the Cherokee, famous, of course, when her first husband was killed in 1755 in a battle, she just picks up a rifle and takes his place. After, in the late 1750s, she marries an Irish trader named Bryant Ward and became known after that as Nancy Ward to the English-speaking people. And her life is this amazing combination of political and military prowess, as well as someone who's known for the economic and domestic expertise valued in white society. As a spokesman for the Cherokee, Ward had the right to spare prisoners taken in raids. And in 1776, she spared the life of Lydia Bean at Fort Watauga. And after regaining her health as a captive, Lydia Bean shared a particular loom weaving technique and dairy farming experience with Ward, who then passed it on to other Cherokee women. So there's a kind of a connection there being made between the expertise of the woman of English descent and the Cherokee woman who spared her life. There's one episode I read about after the Revolution where Ward got to meet with John Sevier in particular to discuss American settlements along the Little Pigeon River. And here we still have this disconnect between what a man of European descent and a Native woman expect out of life. She's shocked that it's a bunch of men who came to talk about settling families. She's like, where are your women? Why is it just men here? And he's shocked. Why would they send a woman to negotiate an important treaty? This doesn't click somehow. And in her later years in life, Nancy Ward's running an inn, because that's one of those things that women are comfortable doing, that people are comfortable with women doing. In stark contrast, of course, Sarah Hawkins, Mr. Sevier's first wife, and Catherine Cheryl, his second wife, they're famous for their bravery, their hard work, and really harsh conditions on the frontier during open conflict with the Cherokee. Sarah Hawkins Sevier herself lost her life, having just given birth to her 10th child, has to try to run to the stockade for safety during an Indian attack, and she just can't survive. She's just given birth too recently, and her strength fail her. And Bonnie Kate, We'll give John Sevier 8 more children. Um, and and they both have these really hard lives. So even though it's a century later, they would have been building a new society the same way that the women of Jamestown had in 1619. So we have many stories of these strong, hardworking, brave women who made America possible. So if at this point, I don't know if you want to hop back on, Hope, but I'm happy to take any questions that anybody might have.
Hi, Nancy. So I'm going to monitor our comments, and I'll let you know if any questions do arise. There is one already that I'll present while we're kind of waiting for people as well. And that's the question of, I know you mentioned medieval guild systems. And in the colonial era, from what I understand, skilled labor, for example, being a cooper or a blacksmith, was very like a middle class. That was kind of your way to be middle class, right? Like Paul Revere, or excuse me, Paul Revere, you know, as a silversmith and things like that. But how did women fit in the role of skilled labor? Were they ever taken on as apprentices? I've always heard, and you can correct me if this is wrong, but I've always heard that many brewers were actually women. Women took up the role of being brewers, which I guess is a kind of domestic as well. But how did they fit in the role of being skilled labor?
Well, that's a cool question. And the thing is, there I would contrast the European experience from what I know of the American experience. So in Europe, actually, there were some exclusively female guilds. And being a member of a guild in Europe, in the European context, usually meant that you had to be the child of a member of the guild. So if you were the son or daughter of a guild master, you would be expected to, if you're a son and it's a male dominated guild, you would become, if your father's a carpenter, you're going to be a carpenter, and you're going to marry the daughter of a carpenter, because the workshop doesn't work if the woman's not handling the business and the feeding and the paying and all that stuff, because the men are doing the craft and the women are running the business. That's the European model. And the exclusively female ones would have been things like, there's lace making, there is brewing, there's a midwife's guild. So there are things that are considered purely women's work that have to be done by women. And then there are a couple of mixed guilds, because, for example, tailors in the 17th and 18th century, for the most part, a woman's not going to go to a male tailor. She's going to go to a seamstress. So the tailors guilds will have female members to make women and children's clothing, and men will make men's clothing. And, you know, that's just modesty. That makes a lot of sense. In the American context, we don't have that same exclusivity. In the colonial context, you can't simply say, well, you must be the child of a carpenter to be a carpenter, because people need work and you need the work done. And so there's more openness to apprentices. And I think, in fact, that does tend to shut women out a little bit, because if now you don't have to be the descendant of a craftsman, you're going to look for any man willing to take on the apprenticeship and do the work. And largely that's going to be men who are looking for work. It's not going to be the daughters. I do think you will continue to see this pattern. In colonial America, you will see this pattern where the wife of a craftsman will understand how to run the business. Because one of the things that does carry over from the European tradition is that if a master craftsman dies, his widow can keep the business running, because they have outstanding contracts and apprentices and other employees. And so if she shuts shop just because her husband died, all of that is lost. And so ironically, the most expendable part of a craft shop is the master, because the wife will keep the business running and his journeymen and apprentices will keep the craft going. But I do think that you see many fewer women in craft guilds in the Americas than you do in the European sense.
Okay, thank you. Hope, you have a question?
Yeah, I do. I was wondering what the education would be like for women, or if there was really any in the very beginning of the colonies. Um, and with the indentured servants versus slave people, or just the matriarch of the family. How did they become literate? I know you mentioned the pilgrims. Pilgrims were more literate to read the Bible and everything, but in the back country, how did that work out?
Well, so that's a good point. So in the cities, especially northern cities dominated by Puritans, the daughters would have been literate anyway because their father would have made sure they can read the Bible. So that's going to be central to their lives. I think in other religious communities, other Christian communities, if you're more accustomed to the clergy reading the Bible to you, you don't have as many people who are actually literate. Um, and in fact, I would say throughout the 19th century, there's not uh, a huge push to make sure everybody can read and write, not until like late 19th century, especially for girls. Um, the girls who would have been literate in colonial America would have been the children of the elite, probably. Um, there was a sense since the early 17th century in Europe that if you're an elite family and your daughter is likely to have to manage servants and is likely to have to maybe deal with renters or contracts or anything, she needs to know at least enough to do that without being taken advantage of. It wouldn't have been formal education, probably. You don't have a lot of academies for women, for example. You would have the boys will go to a schoolhouse to talk. Girls in small groups would have uh, a governess, a tutor, something like that. So the education is less formal, but it really depends on your class more than anything else. And I think most of the people out in the back country, if you don't need to read and write, there's not a lot of push to make sure you can. So it really depends on what your work in life is like. So in colonial America, I don't think there would have been a lot of formal education for girls, but there might, depending on their family status, it would have been at home.
Okay, great. And I got one more question here via our comments here. But later on in the 18th and 19th centuries, you have lots of immigrants, of course, coming to the United States. Now, we are an immigrant nation, of course, but how did these immigrants from later times, did they challenge the status quo, or did they add to it, be it German or Irish or whoever? How did they fit into this kind of social landscape?
Um, I guess it depends on sort of like where you're looking. So I know that there was quite a bit of conflict as, say, formerly Dutch areas are now dominated by English law. There's a lot of pushback against that. Under Dutch law, for example, in Pennsylvania and New Jersey, husbands and wives, especially among Quaker families, would have been considered equal religiously and economically. And so when English law comes along and they say, well, no, actually now she no longer has inheritance rights, there's going to be a huge pushback against that. Like, what do you mean my daughter can't inherit? So they have to make exceptions. So in early American law, so like right after the revolution, they really grapple with that because especially immigrant communities are going to make demands about what they expect to be able to do for their own families. Individuals are pretty much vulnerable to the forces around them. Um, so even if it's really weird to you that women don't have a political voice, or whatever it is you're trying to make sense of, um, there are certain tasks, for example, that might be considered men's work in one culture and women's work in another. And so you encounter, I don't know, the first male doctors to deliver babies, that was totally weird to a lot of people. That's something midwives had been doing since the Middle Ages. And so to have a male doctor deliver a baby, even something as simple like that, takes a lot of getting used to. So there are little spots of conflict here and there, to be sure. In terms of what that meant for colonial women's work, I think if you're a recent immigrant, chances are you're a servant, an indentured servant, and so you show up and you just do what you're told, even if you don't have a lot of training in that area.
Okay, well, that looks like to be the end of it. Well, thank you again, Professor. We appreciate your time and, of course, your lovely presentation. I just want to remind everyone that if you didn't catch this, you'll be able to catch it on our YouTube. We'll be sending it out, so you'll be able to watch it all from the beginning, all of the lovely presentation we have here. So I want to thank as well the Humanities Tennessee and the Endowment of the Humanities, of course, for their funding with the CARES Act and the Economic Stabilization Plan 2020, excuse me. And then remember that Marble Springs State Historic Site is funded under an agreement under TDEC and THC. But otherwise, keep a lookout for other